So good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. I am David Troy, co-curator of TEDxMidAtlantic, and we're thrilled to bring you a very special program today, part of a series of programs we're doing on defending democracy against unethical manipulation and undue influence. So we know that data is playing an increasingly important role in how our democracies function, and most of us accept that data will be used to target people to get them to vote one way or another, but there's also a darker side. When data can be used to manipulate us into not voting or into thinking that our vote simply doesn't matter, or maybe when data pulls us into networks of influence that change how we perceive reality itself, we cross a threshold into something more nefarious and which our two guests today needs far more transparency. Our first guest is David Carroll, a professor at the Parsons School of Design in New York City. He made headlines in 2017 when he tried, by making a request under UK law, to get his data file from the British firm Cambridge Analytica. What happened next became part of the Netflix documentary, The Great Hack. Just last week, David was able to finally get a copy of his data file, and we'll be playing a clip from the UK Channel 4 segment in just a moment. Welcome, David.
Great to be here, Dave. Thanks for having me.
And so our second guest is Brent Allpress, who is by trade an architectural and urban design academic in Melbourne, Australia. Brent is the key researcher behind the just released documentary film People You May Know by Katerina Gillein and Charles Creel. Allpress found that Colorado-based firm Gloo, a Cambridge Analytica offshoot, has been illegally using mental health data to target people, including members of the military in multiple countries, for religious and political indoctrination. Welcome, Brent.
Very good to be here.
Thanks a lot. So those of you that may have questions during this session, please feel free to use the Zoom Q&A box. And so we're going to kick things off here with David Carroll. And to do that, we're going to first play this clip from Channel 4's report on him from last week.
David, hello.
Hello.
How you doing?
Welcome.
I've come to give David Carroll a surprise. This mild-mannered New York professor has spent 4 years fighting to get the data the notorious company Cambridge Analytica had on him.
I became obsessed with finding answers.
His story forms part of the hit documentary, The Great Hack.
The Cambridge Analytica case is behind me now. They pleaded guilty for not giving me my data, and I'll probably never get it back.
Carroll won the legal rows, but never got his full data after Cambridge Analytica refused and then went bust. But the file forms part of the Trump campaign database obtained by Channel 4 News. But he doesn't yet know what we've got. David, why did you want to get your data?
To see if it was possible, to try and pry open the secret world of voter targeting. It's a mystery otherwise.
What were you worried about?
Worried about our data being abused, used against us, used to exploit the divisions and fractures in American society, to divide and conquer.
What kind of blowback did you get? Was it stressful?
It was stressful because Cambridge Analytica really did not want me to pursue this lawsuit.
So what did you end up getting?
I got some data, which was a very thin profile. It had my voter registration information, which is publicly accessible, but it had a model of my political beliefs, so issues ranked, and it certainly wasn't anything near what the company bragged that it had on us.
What did you think when you saw Cambridge Analytica implode? You know, when the stories started running, when the Channel 4 News expose, was broadcast.
We did all the research, all the data, all the analytics, all the targeting.
That I wasn't going to get the answers to our questions. Where did they get it? What did they do with it? And who did they share it with?
So you were trying to get the data that Cambridge Analytica held on you in 2016. We have obtained the Trump campaign database from 2016.
That's hard. I mean, it's like, how else would we be able to see that?
You can search it, and what we found is a file for David Carroll.
It's more than this?
Well, let's have a look. So now you got a few sort of simple things about issues. What we have here is your openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism scores.
A very low neuroticism score, thankfully. And the percentiles, see, this is critical. People who have very high conscientiousness and very high neuroticism scores, they would be very easily manipulated and have no idea it's happening.
Okay, so that's just the personality info. So we go down to commercial information.
It knows what kind of car I have, it knows if I'm a gamer, it knows my investments, it knows how I eat, knows if I use coupons. It knows, if I've ever written a blog. It knows, how I use the internet, whether I use social media, whether I have a home office, our donations.
All the charities that you support.
Indeed, yep. This is what we were fighting to get. This is what I knew was there. I think every voter has a right to see this. It's crazy that we don't have the right to see this. It's crazy that you have to come and show me mine.
That's the David Carroll file from the Trump campaign from 2016.
Yeah, well, when you showed me my personality model, that shows that they had tried to calculate that. And
that's what psychographics are.
That's that openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion model, which is very controversial whether or not it works. But what matters to me more is that they said we didn't do that for the Trump campaign.
Cambridge Analytica said that.
Yes. And for example, Matt Oskowski, who's currently working for the campaign, he said on the record when asked by a reporter, sorry to disappoint you, but we didn't do psychographics for the Trump campaign. Well, why do I have one in my file, Matt? It's just a level of abuse that we're tolerating in this country. And we can't. It works as a suppression system. It works to subvert the will of the people.
So would you like the file?
It's been a long time coming. After all this time, just to click it is all it took. Well, thank you. Obviously, I'm pleased that it's gotten into your hands for this purpose, but ideally, we wouldn't have to rely on you to get these questions answered.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was, I think a really good introduction to what we're about to see next. Maybe, David, you can actually take us into your data file and show us some of the things that you found.
Sure. Be delighted to share what Krishnan from Channel 4 gave to me. But before I do, I just wanted to give some context and sort of two important things to consider that make my file unique, perhaps. One is that I was not a targeted voter by any stretch, and Channel 4 said that voters who were targeted had much, much more intricate, denser files, and I was not in a battleground district. The ICO also indicated that the depth of files varied greatly, and the company's exaggeration was that every voter had thousands of data points. The closer truth was some voters had huge files and others had very thin ones. And then the other important thing is I consider myself very privacy defensive. I do the work of trying to protect my data. And so I would say that the specimen I'm going to show you is probably the bare minimum for those two reasons, and that most people have more than me, and targeted voters probably have way more than me. So here is the first tab of the file, and you can see I've redacted just some of my birthday and things, but it has all my ID numbers. Here's another tab which lists ethnic group. This would be a coding, we believe, that would indicate that I'm white. Education and null and occupation weren't there, which is sort of either an example of me protecting my data, or they just didn't invest in figuring this out about me. And of course, here's the personality score. This was what they claimed they did not have. This was what the Information Commissioner was not able to produce. And we can see the percentiles. If the percentiles here are out of 100, then you can see I'm sort of little below average in extroversion, a little above average in agreeableness. And like I said in the segment, very glad that my neuroticism is quite low.
And then these scores are really key because these are the things that enable you to be potentially emotionally targeted by, various kinds of advertising materials.
Yeah, what I've always been worried about is people who are in the upper percentiles on these dimensions. That would make you a target because you're an outlier. And then these scores work in a sort of fishing analogy where this is the fish finder, and then you set the bait. And once you get the hook, then these scores aren't needed anymore. Then you're able to test messages on those individuals. So it's really about finding the outliers in a population in a battleground district. So it doesn't matter that these scores aren't accurate to most people. What only matters is that they can be used to identify potential targets that then can be tested on. The next tab is the RNC ID. And then we start to get into some of the issues recorded in the RNC database, but important here is the date of when this was created. So this is being done in the spring of 2016. And up here we see some of the particular client-based categories. And I find it funny here that I'm not angry about jobs, but clearly finding voters that were potentially angry about jobs were a key target of the Trump campaign. And if you scroll up here, you can get more of the voter based file. Then we started getting into the data brokers. So LL stands for labels and lists. And this is where we get some of my income, and you can see some of the earlier campaign candidates and issues: Affordable Care Act, gay marriage, gun control, school choice, privatizing Social Security. You can get pro-life, pro-choice, church attendee. I thought it was funny that it didn't find that I'm a frequent Twitter user. All the donations, and so on. Then you can get the household. So linking me to the other members of my household and our consumer profile. A lot of the stuff was accurate, especially the median income and home value stuff. That would make sense that they could get that. Here is AR, which stands for Aristotle. And I noticed in this segment, they got the number of children wrong, but in another file, they got the number of children correct and also their ages. This is from the Data Trust linking to Axiom, probably this Ax key up here. And then you can see potentially how they might be able to target me on different media channels. I was glad to see they did not get an email address for me. They did buy a lot of email addresses. And of course, emails are not only useful for direct response, but as a unique identifier to retarget you across platforms and campaigns. Here's info group, donations by month, even how you would pay and the amounts. I was glad these were zero, but also wanted to say we do make donations. So I'm not as stingy as I look here. Here is info group's individual file. A lot of interesting data points here. So some of the things were quite accurate. And then that is linked to the household by info group on this tab. And another interesting set of just hundreds of really interesting categorizations that are normally used to sell skin creams and ski vacations, but in this case, potentially to create profiles for deterrence or disinformation campaigns. On the last two tabs is Aristotle's commercial and individual files. So from my perspective, as a privacy defensive person, I was glad to see a lot of null values, and it would be really fascinating to compare my file to a targeted voters file, but I don't know if we're ever going to be able to do that. I think the important thing to think about is no campaigns making the mistake of exporting data to the UK again So in 2020, we will have no rights to ask for this data, that we will be in the dark even more than we were in 2016. So in some ways, things have been pushed into the shadows. And an interesting tidbit in the ICO report that came out, that Cambridge Analytica was in the process of offshoring its operations because it knew that being in a data protecting state like the UK or an EU member state means that it has to disclose this stuff under law. And so this stuff gets pushed into the shadows, which calls for the reason why the United States really needs to consider whether or not all voters deserve rights to access their voter file. It seems like we need that, regardless of whether you think Cambridge Analytica was snake oil or not, effective or not, scary or not. I think we can all agree that we should have rights to see our own files. And currently there's no law that requires that in the United States. So thanks, Dave.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of recap a couple of the key points here, I think the first thing, is to remind our, viewers that the reason why your data file, was sort of spotty in coverage is because they didn't invest necessarily a lot in trying to win you over, because you didn't meet kind of the first pass criteria of being a persuadable voter, or somebody whose behavior could be affected, let's say, not necessarily even persuadable. So I think, a lot of people would say, okay, there's been this kind of targeting and demographic research going on the American public for decades. What makes this, perhaps different than, say, what Catalyst was doing for the Democrats in 1998 or 2004 or whatever it was? Would you care to maybe characterize that?
I think, it's fair to say that the Republicans and the Democrats in general use comparable voter analytics files because the open market allows it for sale and there's nothing stopping it from getting all linked together. So what is troubling is that there's no transparency into it, and that when operatives are asked about these practices, they don't tell the truth. They don't tell the truth to reporters. They don't tell the truth to lawmakers. So how can we hold this industry accountable if we have no tools to do so? So the fear is, what we cannot see. And so I think we need to open this industry up to scrutiny to preserve our faith in the systems. And we understand that the data can be used for positive and negative ends. The data itself is not necessarily nefarious. It's how it is used that matters. And we need a window into the use and abuse, because both are happening. We just don't know which is the appropriate use and which is the nefarious abuse, but both are happening.
Yeah, and we don't really have in this country, as you point out, the right to see our data, and we also don't have consistent laws about how that kind of data is applied and used in the real world. One question before we move on to Brent: a lot of people are interested to know what kind of privacy practices would you recommend to keep your data profile as lean as possible within the context of these data brokers?
So those of you who are California residents have a lot more rights than other states because of the California law. So California residents should exercise their rights to request data from companies and organizations, to challenge them when you're not satisfied. The Attorney General is tasked with enforcing that new law, to potentially participate in the ballot initiative to further upgrade that law in California. So California is leading the way in the United States. Vermont passed a law that made data brokers register. So for the first time, we actually have a list of all the data brokers that are in operation. Before that, we didn't even know who they were. So if you're willing to do a lot of work, you can reach out to data brokers and have your files purged. It's too much work, though. There's too much burden on the individual, not enough guide rails and guideposts for the industry. So I think the best thing to do is actually do democracy to make the situation better for voters and consumers in the United States. But I've been using an ad blocker for almost 10 years now. I wouldn't go online without an ad blocker, and protect my device with special tools as well. You wouldn't go outside naked. So why do you go on the internet without tracking protection?
Right. And I think, your data certainly is rich enough for, I think, people to, for it to be useful. And I think people would be surprised that even with using an ad blocker and taking reasonable steps as you've done, you can still create this very rich data file. I think most of us that, perhaps aren't quite as, aware of those issues or taking as much action as we could would have very much richer data files. And we should point out that of this Cambridge Analytica / Trump campaign data, I guess Channel 4 is referring to it as Trump campaign data, and they're not really saying where they got it from. We don't know even through that channel, what other data files look like, because the only one that we've gotten is yours, right?
Yes. And I think what an important question that remains is, is the RNC continuing to use ocean scores in its database? And if so, are those ocean scores derived from the Kogan data? And if the answer is yes, then you could say that the RNC is still contaminated by the scandal of 2016 and has not cleaned up its act or sanitized its data. So I'd be interested to know if the RNC can make the claim that it has sanitized its database from this disaster.
And again, I think to be clear, the real ethical conundrum with respect to the use of this data is to use these personality scores specifically for things like voter suppression. I think that's something that really crosses a lot of lines for people, and we need a lot more transparency into. So thank you for that quick tour. We'll return to do a group conversation with David and Brent after we spend a little bit of time with Brent. So what I wanted to do is to go ahead and play the trailer for this new film called People You May Know, which is now available for streaming on Amazon Prime through, I think, Sundance Channel. Is that correct, Brent?
Yeah, that's right. Okay. And yeah.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and play this trailer. And again, this is People You May Know, just released last week.
Do people in churches know their personal information is being gathered to use in political campaigns?
No.
The meetings are secret, the membership is secret. Kellyanne Conway is a member, Steve Bannon is a member. They hope to use Trump as God's wrecking ball.
I had used and worked with predictive analytics and big data tools. What would it look like to use it within the realm of ministry? There's no better product than the gospel.
I read an article that you said you worked with the original data guys, Cambridge Analytica.
We worked with
I was sure that there must be something that would lead us to being able to nail Cambridge Analytica.
There's a reason that not many people have come forward and spoken about Cambridge Analytica.
I'm in Paddington Station and I've got this hard drive on me and I'm just terrified.
It helps us to track people. It helps us to keep track of all the kids that are here.
All of a sudden you have this ability to enumerate things about Beth, or you can draw it out.
They began isolating me away from my family.
With one person, it's like, one single grain of gunpowder.
And then we have here taking the state for Christ together.
But when you've got a huge pile of it, you don't want a match to get anywhere near it because it'll kill you.
You can add the family dynamic of propensity for divorce.
They're targeting extraordinarily vulnerable individuals.
Opioid dependence, different mental health disorders.
States decide to rewrite the U.S. Constitution.
The ultimate position to be in is when your adversary has no idea that they're in a war.
My secret recorders are these.
Past security, past the Secret Service.
Vice President.
I bring greetings from President Donald Trump.
There's two ways to rewrite the U.S. Constitution. You can handle marriage equality. You can handle issues of women's rights, term limits.
The American government is slated for destruction.
We own the relationship space. Like, we own it. That's the church.
Okay, so again, that was the trailer for People You May Know, just released on streaming this last week. And so Brent Alpress was the principal researcher behind this film. And I think, really came into some startling discoveries. I was actually introduced to Brent about 10 days ago by a mutual friend named Ann Nelson. And I was really interested to learn about this misuse of data that was well beyond what I was already aware of, which was quite a lot. I do research in the disinformation space, so follow this realm pretty closely. And Brent, you really found some, I think, startling things. Maybe you could just kind of summarize exactly what was going on in this company that you found and what we can learn from it.
Yeah, sure. I've got some slides that I'll also show just to kind of give some context, and they provide their own diagrams, which is kind of helpful. So I was sitting on my couch, this couch in Melbourne in May of 2018 when going through browsing the latest news, I came across the bankruptcy of Cambridge Analytica, which I thought was a surprise to me that they unraveled that quickly from the Channel 4 expose. I engaged in a thought experiment on the spot, which was someone should look at their creditor lists in the bankruptcy documents. So I did that. And it was on the assumption that a creditor may not be a creditor might be a client or a partner. And I then went through and found there were three companies that stood out. One was a gaming app that got extended Facebook friend access, and that's a sort of separate question.
Hey, Brent, a couple of people are saying that your screen is black. Is that intentional?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
Okay.
I'm about to start here.
There we go.
There we go. So, so the no, that was just my first. There's a placeholder. So there were two companies on that creditor list that had silly names. One was the Culture of Freedom Initiative, and the other one was the Relationship Engagement Collaborative. Wordy names. They suggested a mix of libertarian and evangelical non-profit backgrounds, and that's exactly what they were. Both affiliated with Koch Group, and both affiliated with the Philanthropy Roundtable, which is a kind of umbrella vehicle for the Koch Group, and a series of philanthropic projects like the K-12 schools that Betsy Davis runs. And the other key initiative from 2015 onwards was Cultural Freedom Initiative. They set up a contract with Gloo and Cambridge Analytica. Gloo themselves set up a contract with themselves and with Cambridge Analytica through their own non-profit called Relationship Enrichment Collaborative. So there's a little bit of complex accounting going on there.
Yeah, and just to simplify this just a bit, Brett, I think it's, this is a lot for a lot of people to take in. So what we're basically seeing here is this organization called Cultural Freedom Initiative that works tightly with both Cambridge Analytica and a company called Gloo out of Boulder. Is that right?
They contracted them.
I see.
So they're clients basically. So Gloo is a Christian mobile app software developer. They do mentoring apps. They were very small initially, and they also contracted Cambridge Analytica via their own non-profit called Relationship Engagement Collaborative. That's a complex little triangle, so that gave me a kind of a pipe down through into something that just wasn't being looked at by others. And so I went through. You're looking at here at a 990, which is it's an annual statement from a non-profit, just explaining which contracts they've had and what expenditure they've had. So I just went through those, and then I literally followed the money. and then dug into the company and saw what they were doing. There was a key figure, John Paul de Gance, JP de Gance. This is him at the Council for National Policy, and he is pitching for donor money effectively, somewhat surreptitiously, because they shouldn't be pitching for donor money, but it's a mixture of donors and doers at the Council for National Policy. Secret organisation, secret membership, secret meetings.
And if you'd like a good book on that, check out Shadow Network by Ann Nelson.
Absolutely. Ann's the authority on the Council for National Policy. As I went through this process of unpacking the company relationships and their activities, I sort of uncovered a range of relationships. The connection back to the Council for National Policy actually came through the film when Charles Creel, one of the filmmakers, asked me to look at them and see if I could find out any more about them, because they've been in dialogue with Anne. And from there I discovered I was able to access their secret website, because it wasn't very well structured and it was actually publicly searchable. And JP de Gance was floating this project within this very, very conservative umbrella group. It's a mixture of oil money and religious evangelical dominionist groups. There's some sort of troubling racial politics in this group, which is coded as heritage, which they have a certain kind of bias, let's put it that way. They have a history. This is a slide of JP de Gance pitching to the donors at the Philanthropy Round Table. And so the idea behind this project was to set up a micro-targeting app called Gloo Insights. What they were wanting to do was to micro-target the unchurched in areas around churches, and to invite them into small group and event functions, and particularly they were targeting people who are going through marriage stress or financial stress, and they were looking to increase marriage and church attendance. On the face of it, that sounded like the sort of thing a church would do. So when I first looked at it, I thought, well, that's kind of what you'd expect. But then when I dug back into the original donor pitches, it was very clearly set up as a framework for demographic engineering for 5-year cycle. And they had a projection forward of the targeting particular swing districts and states, and looking at a kind of, basically if you're married and you go to church, you're more likely to vote for a Republican president.
Yeah, and just real quick, I think a lot of people would say, there's nothing wrong with that. And the churches, churches have always targeted people who are, in a moment of transition or in a time of need, because they're there to help ostensibly. But I think what you found is that this is a lot more nefarious than that, because of how it's being done. Yeah.
So the key issue was that they were using self-declared mental and behavioural and health treatment data in order to target people who were very vulnerable out in the community. They were matching that with data broker data, the sort of stuff we saw from David previously. So Gloo have a data set of 2,000 data points on every American, and they're sourcing that from, they declared internally that they source it from Wonderman and Axiom and LiveRamp, Kantar and Ethnic Technologies, and they're the kind of big dominant data brokers. Just to give you a sense of the closeness of the Council for National Policy to the current political administration in Washington, this is a letter of thanks from the Vice President from March of this year for consistently amplifying the agenda of President Trump and the administration around the COVID-19 policy. So that's in March, and we just had the disclosures that there was actually effectively an influence campaign occurring where the seriousness of the epidemic was being downplayed. There's a few other groups that help promote this project. So basically, there's a micro-targeting database. It collects data from congregation members. The churches use this micro-targeting platform in order to do advertising for prospective new congregant members, and they've set up a range of small groups, counselling services around their churches to feed people in, and they targeting them out in the community. And the context for it is explicitly political internally, not externally. Externally, it's presented as being about a growth journey, a personal kind of growth. Internally, it's more explicitly a political agenda. The lineage for the Gloo micro-targeting platform, it's the Insights platform, is traceable back to Cambridge Analytica's involvement with the cruise campaign. So this is these are the equivalent of the ocean psychographic subcategories for Christians that they developed. They were first developed for the cruise campaign, and I've sort of matched. So these are Gloo's versions, but they're actually pretty much identical. A little bit of extra development to the ones used in the cruise campaign, and they are kind of subcategories specific to Christians.
So what you're kind of suggesting here is that they may have used Cambridge Analytica's data as a kind of a starting point, and then enriched the data further with the information that they were able to add on their own.
The information I have is that actually there was very early involvement in a political context with this entire project. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't that they came along later, that they were there in 2015.
Right. So this Gloo app and the Gloo company were very explicitly a political project, not necessarily a strictly a religious affiliated kind of effort.
That's the appearance of the project. I think it's hard to argue that there isn't a political context for it, given the way in which they presented themselves. This is a data broker. This is a data scientist's very helpful diagram of the. Let's shift this out of the way. Of the data sources for the Gloo Insights platform. So there's the one on the left is all of the data broker data sets that we saw with David's file that was provided to him. The one in the middle is Gloo's engagement platform. That's a reveal survey, which is a psychometric or psychographic survey. It's basically an ocean survey with a Christian overlay. It's very, very similar to Cambridge University's ocean survey, a little bit of swapping of grammar. And 500,000 Christians have filled out that survey over the last 4 years. And from there, you can model the rest. The assessments that are psychographic assessments within apps that Gloo run. And there's a range of behavioral data that they gather from the apps that they run. So they have mentoring apps. And then champion files are these sort of small groups and volunteers and other kind of, again, behavioral data through the actions of the groups they've set up. So the key issue here is that revealed survey data in its in the privacy sort of provisions of that survey, it's meant to be anonymized. It's not meant to be able to be used for it's meant to be aggregated. It's not meant to be used in a micro-targeting context. So that's the first problem.
Yeah, and I need to just hurry us up a little bit, Brent, because we're running out of time. I want to make sure we have time for questions.
Yep. So what they've done is set up these small groups, and they target the vulnerable people. So divorce care, grief share, single parenting. People are being targeted in the community who are suffering from stress and anxiety, and they have the data on them for that. And then from there, they're able to invite them in and convert them to membership. At a certain point in 2019, they declared that they were rescinding all that access to sensitive data filters. And you can see the listing there: behavioral health, anxiety self-reported, ADHD self-reported, depression self-reported, and then treatment data, and then model data on alcohol dependence, chronic pain, and opioid dependence. In accessing the actual Gloo platform, I've discovered that they have retained those sensitive, self-declared mental and behavioural health categories as filters. You can see from the population that it's basically everybody, and this is an audience builder where they create audiences and then export them out to Facebook through custom audiences. So here you can see an example of zooming down to specific locations. So this is New York State. And then as you go to a particular smaller location, the numbers go down. The numbers aren't matching what would be modelled for depression in the community. They're far, far more specific, but they're still large numbers. And then going down further again into, and you can go down to a 5K radius within a point, or you can create a polygon and do a bespoke. So what you're doing is creating a kind of geolocated audience. There are a series of filters that are demographic and religious and financial, but also for me, the kind of key issue is these very, very sensitive mental health filters. And in Gloo's own demos, they have examples of this. So they've got mental event, anxiety, depression, millennial, Gen X, insured. So that's a kind of that's an example of the sort of audiences that they were creating in the demo. They then send that through to Facebook through Facebook Business Manager. So the issue for me is they're using custom audiences. So they're using audiences with what appears to be illicit data, and then that's being sent through custom audiences at Facebook, and then that's hashed but then delivered as adverts to individual people who were set up through the filters on the Insights platform. In terms of where the application for this is, it's also particularly concerning some of the partners of Gloo. So Campus Crusade for Christ became Crew, but they also merged with military ministries to form Crew Military. And this is an example of basically a dominionist radicalization program for active service members. They have representation across every military base in the States for all of the different services, and the agenda there is really to undermine the separation of church and state with military recruits. There's a range of instances across the material where there's a very explicit acknowledgement that this is for political campaign use. And this is from one of their internal promotional activities. And the other thing that concerned me was in December of last year, Cloud Commerce, which is Pascal's, his company merged with Cloud Commerce. Data Propria, which is ex-Cambridge Analytica staff, were acquired by that company, and they'd worked previously on Trump's campaign. And in December of last year, they announced that they had acquired exclusive marketing access to a database for 80 million Christians with enriched psychographic profiles. And then they have a swarm model where they effectively are matching that data to other databases. So this requires further investigation in terms of it's a very opaque contract. There isn't at this stage a direct link between this and Gloo, but in my research, I can't find any other source for any other likely source for the data. Barna would be the other company that had been doing psychographic surveys, and they've merged with Gloo, and they're doing a joint project this year. We've pivoted very quickly into being a COVID-19 service provider for online church delivery. And again, this whole question of anxiety and stress and isolation and uncertainty are kind of triggers. So they're providing kind of counselling services, and they're kind of doing these regular surveys. the other concerning development for me after the film had finished was to discover that Gloo was really part of a cluster of companies that were invested in by Bridge Builders Collaborative. So the owner of Gloo, the founding owner, is a member of Bridge Builders Collaborative, and they've invested in 15 companies that have apps and services in the mental health, mindfulness and meditation space. And Gloo is listed in one instance as the engagement platform for the Multiversity, which is a sort of mindfulness center that's owned by Scott Crine, and he's a key investor within Bridge Builders, and he's on the board of both Gloo and Headspace.
So I think we need to try to wrap up real quick, Brent, because we want to have time for questions.
This is my last slide. So, so my concern with all of this is that you've got a process by which people can be micro-targeted for mental health issues. Micro-targeting is questionable in terms of its efficacy, but in the context of mental health concerns, people are extraordinarily vulnerable to messaging. They're already persuadable within a belief context of churches. And then there's potentially a wider problem here in relationship to services that relate to stress and anxiety, potentially also being sources of data harvesting. I'm not making that claim for these companies that are associated with Gloo. Again, that's going to take further investigation, but within Gloo itself, there's ample evidence that they're actually harvesting their own clients' data and then are using it for other purposes.
So just to kind of recap the key findings there, I think the main thing is that we're sort of going beyond this ocean score idea of psychological targeting and moving much more into something much more detailed and specific for people who are facing potentially crisis or have other ongoing problems that feel like that they could be potentially targeted by or aided by religion and other kinds of spiritual and wellness practices and that kind of thing. And so there's a whole new front of data kind of opening up on that side that could then be used to kind of rewire the social network of the country. And I think that, I want to make it very clear that this isn't about politics. This is about how we're treating, how we're running our democracy and the kind of rules that we have in place to provide transparency within that context. So you did mention, though, that there was one specific aspect that was really illegal about what was being done. And I wanted to just get a really brief bit of clarity on that. It seems to me as though that some of this mental health care data is subject to HIPAA laws and that laws are being violated.
So what they did is they announced that they'd rescinded the access to the sensitive data last year because of changes in the HIPAA laws. There hadn't been changes in those laws. The company is subject to the HIPAA regulations, and HIPAA regulations state that you can't use mental health data for marketing. It's a very sort of straightforward and obvious thing that you would not want to let happen. It's an extraordinarily dangerous thing to be doing. And if you're engaging in influence campaigns on either side of politics, right across the political spectrum, whether you're trying to activate one side of politics or depress the other side of politics, whether you're with potentially radicalizing the fringe, any kind of mental health data that might be used for influence campaigns is extremely serious. There's also an issue around undermining public health consensus around COVID-19 isolation measures. And for me, at a base level, this is a public health issue.
Right. And I think most people, just from a pure kind of fairness and justice kind of standpoint, most people wouldn't expect that if they talk to a therapist or if they use a mental health app of some kind, or if they visit a church and fill out a survey in the context of their church, they wouldn't expect that would then somehow or another be feeding this massive data file on them.
No,
I think that's just outside of people's regular expectations. You know,
they'd have no idea that was happening. I don't think. There are a group of churches who are alumni churches. They're mega churches, evangelical, and they would be considered to be partners of Gloo, and they were founding partners. And I think the status of those churches is different.
Got it.
There are a lot of other smaller churches that are basically at the moment. There's a kind of this year they're harvesting networks of churches and getting much more data, and it's running across denominations. So it's within Catholic churches and evangelical churches primarily that there's a kind of strong outreach.
Okay, so I think we're going to need to wrap up pretty soon, but we can run a couple of minutes over past 2 for those of you that can stay. But I'd like to try to get some questions in. We have a lot of people asking different things. Travis asked you, David, should Americans be concerned about psychographics and disinformation influencing the 2020 election? I would argue that's all happening right now. And what can we do as citizens to put a stop to this crisis?
Sure. So we don't have the tools to determine that because we don't have the transparency requirements that were accidental in the case of 2016 because our data was exported to the UK. And so this weird regulatory loophole of US citizens asking for their data came to be. But what's important is that these practices are standard across the industry, that the critics or skeptics of Cambridge Analytica say that there's nothing special about the data itself, it's how it is used. So more transparency is present in this election as compared to 2016, for example, because of the Facebook ads library. So we have a little bit more visibility and heightened awareness, but we need more tools for scrutiny.
Yeah, I'd take that further and say that there's potential misuse of data which has public health consequences and is potentially very, very risky and damaging. And it's not just normal data broker activities or advertising activities, it's something that requires enforcement action.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we have a bunch of questions. We're not going to be able to get to them all, but I'll try to get to several. So somebody asked, how many people were targeted in the context of the Gloo data set? Just what kind of scale is it?
260 million.
So that's basically every US adult, right?
Yeah, anyone who can vote.
Yeah, and the way that sometimes that's possible too is they don't necessarily have collected data points on everybody, but they're able to model them using AI. Is that basically correct?
Yeah, it's a mixture. So they've got 2,000 points of data on everybody. They've invested heavily in evangelical modeling, so enriched data on the evangelical sector, and they've also they're particularly focusing on industries like opioid addiction recovery and financial services and financial counseling. So there's a business model sitting in behind this as well that is, of course, for a high degree of concern.
Got it. Yeah. So yeah, just for those wondering, like for the data points you don't have, if you have say 800 of 1,000, you can infer the other 200 fairly readily with a pretty decent degree of accuracy.
So my concern is that there's a potential de-anonymization of anonymized health data. The other concern I'd have is that the custom audience service in Facebook is actually facilitating the use of third-party external audiences that are
so it's this cross-correlation of anonymized data sets where you're able to then kind of de-anonymize them because you've got two related sets.
Well, you've got huge data brokers. Take 100 data points to de-anonymize someone. They've got 2,000. So
one other point that people maybe don't always consider is that once this data is kind of aggregated and out in the wild on a given person, it persists and you don't really change. and your data doesn't necessarily substantially change over time. So it's accretive. You know, this problem sort of grows in scope and scale over time as this data kind of persists in the wild. So we wanted to address a question that Richard asked via email yesterday. He says that we learned after the 26th election that certain firms got caught with a whole bunch of egg on their Facebook. Cambridge Analytica no longer exists, but are there similar firms active today as we approach this election? Maybe David, you could.
Sure. I mean, Funware is a great example of a company that was created for the Trump campaign, and as was mentioned, is part of the PowerScale cloud commerce.
That's PHUNware.
And they really specialize in embedding trackers in apps that then track voters to polling stations and so on, and to churches and so on. So I think there's been a real increase in the geolocation and mobile device as a sort of attack surface that has increased since 2016. And Funware is a company behind that.
Yep.
Yeah, Data Propria was acquired by Cloud Commerce, and that's Cambridge Analytica alumni.
Yeah, I mean, there's several firms that were sort of offshoots, Gloo being one.
Auspex is another one, which is UK based, but it's effectively Cambridge Analytica alumni plus new members.
Yep.
Now, Richard also asked, did Mr. Carroll know that they would have a data file on him personally, or were you just guessing / curious to find out?
Well, I knew that we would have a data file because I was never naive, in the sense that I knew that the data broker industry was selling files, and this practice has been around for decades. So it was about confirming what we knew was there and whether the UK law would enable it. And it turns out it didn't. It was UK journalists that did it.
Right, exactly. Somebody else asked if there's any Russian connections to any of this, and I think that's a complicated answer based on what I know of it. But I don't think that it's just Russia. This is like a big, complicated network of things going on.
I would. My assumption is that there's at least a kind of shared interest in the oil price, and that would go across countries where that's their primary revenue, like Russia and other countries, and also certain companies in America, like Koch Industries. So I don't have evidence that there's any Russian involvement in this particular activity, but there's strong evidence that CNP and Koch Industries have a very, very strong interest in the commodity price for oil. And that also has an issue around maintaining the openness of the economy, keeping people mobile, keeping people driving, lifting the price. So there's a vested interest would be the best way of describing some of that.
No, that makes good sense. So somebody asks, is there any evidence that they used the Facebook lookalike audience to find other people with likely matches to their personality markers, likes, engagements? I mean, I guess that's kind of inherent to the way that Facebook targeting works. If you have, you know, an audience, you can obviously create a lookalike audience on it. So I would assume that's probably the case.
That is.
Yeah, you could even say it would be malpractice not to use that tool.
Yeah, no, they're definitely doing that.
Yeah,
the Gloo describe how they do it in their internal documents.
Okay, so let's see. If anybody else has other questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A box. The chat is okay, but the Q&A is better because we can see them a little bit better. So somebody's saying that about, do you see this question from Shireen, David, about affinity in the Q&A box?
Oh, yes. Shireen asked about that. I tried to answer. So Shireen asked, where is the coding for race that was portrayed in the Channel 4? There were some really obfuscated codings that Channel 4 was able to decode. And so, yes, I was marked as white. And that obviously went up to the district level lists. And I would imagine those codings corroborated across the data brokers. So other factors like ethnic affinity would strengthen a coding of race or ethnicity, which was scattered throughout the file.
Gotcha. So Edith asked if this will be available after this session. Yes, it will. We'll be posting this onto our website. And Stephen Hassan asks about Palantir what's currently up with Palantir. Should they be considered kind of a threat in this space to democracy, or what do we know about what's going on with them? And that being Palantir, the company owned by Peter Thiel.
I think one of the key issues with any of this is that any concentration of analysis and collation of data relating to health by companies needs to be audited very, very carefully. So Palantir have key contracts with the NHS and in the US around COVID, and any companies that are engaging in any data relating to health at the moment, given the material I've looked at, would need to be very, very closely audited.
Makes sense. Matt asks, are there any apps or extensions that can help you pollute your data profile so that you can basically try to foil the data aggregation? My suspicion is that may work for an individual to some extent, but that it doesn't really necessarily get at the larger problem, because this is an attack on society as a whole in some sense. You guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's sort of the similar problem of climate change and feeling guilty about not recycling, that the industry wants to place the burden on individuals when this is a systemic problem that requires international cooperation to solve. Helen Nussbaum is a scholar of privacy and has advocated for the kind of scrambling of data, but I think it's more of a theoretical, because attempts to do so have been blocked. So for example, a browser extension that scrambled your data was blocked by Google Play. So it's a cat and mouse game.
Yeah, go ahead, Brent.
Well, one regulatory change I think needs to be made is that there are instances where companies like Wonderman have acquired Thomson, which was a medical data specialist, and Wonderman is a large data broker. I think that raises risks in terms of anonymization and de-anonymization. Axiom is a large data broker. They spun off LiveRamp, which is a de-anonymizer, and they've formed partnerships with companies that have access to anonymized health data. So I think there needs to be tighter regulation around those sorts of contractual relationships. And I think there's a much higher level of risk in the medical research and pharmaceutical research and hospital space that I don't think that sector is really aware of.
Got it. So Travis asked for Brent, can a campaign buy data from Headspace or other online mental health services?
I don't have any evidence regarding Headspace that data is under any kind of threat or misuse. What I can say is that Gloo is presented as being a platform for for those other apps, and that suggests that there may have been some advertising, marketing done within that cluster using Gloo and its insights platform. So that would be a concern that would require further investigation in order to determine whether that had occurred. If it had occurred, it would be very serious, because Headspace has a user base of 60 million people with 2 million subscribers, and they've just made their subscription service free to all unemployed Americans and UK and all NHS workers. So there's a potential there, given the associations, that would be, a concern. I don't personally have any evidence of that, but I'd be concerned about the kind of the company they keep.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Dave, I just wanted to follow up, because Shireen Mitchell said her question wasn't answered, and I just wanted to clarify to make sure it's clear that there was a race coding in my data set, and I was coded as white. So that was there, but I'm just saying that there's other data that could augment that specific racial coding related to ethnicity and things. Religion 6, for example, was a code Channel 4 was not able to decode all of these codings, but was made some progress in doing so. But I think the important thing is to point out that race and religion and ethnicity are in our data broker files, and they are being used by political campaigns. And they can then be used to get around Facebook's restrictions, because you can make a racially coded list and upload it to custom audiences, and you have targeted by race, even though Facebook says it doesn't allow that.
Yeah, they used to offer, much more specific kind of targeting as part of the platform, but now you can just do that yourself and correlate it back to Facebook IDs. Yeah. So Lauren asks of David, she was really interested in the spreadsheet, but it's a lot of stuff to go through. Is there any chance that that's going to be posted online, like in a shared Google Doc or something at some point, or is that unable to be done right now?
I'm thinking about how to publish it, because I think just even showing the tables of the data brokers is useful, which is otherwise shrouded in mystery by contracts and non-disclosure agreements. So I think it's important for people to see what even just a few data broker fields look like. So I'll be looking for ways to get it out there.
Awesome. Yeah, I think our audience would definitely appreciate that. So Thomas asks, how would a privacy respectful or even just ethical and efficient digital political campaign look like to you? Like, what would be best practices for politics using this kind of data today? What are things that are okay to do but not okay to, and then the other things that are also not okay to do?
Well, don't use mental health data for a start.
Yeah, that's a start.
That'd be a good one. And even if there is some process by which some of that has been gathered through HIPAA compliant frameworks, the application of that data then raises different concerns.
Well, and I think, again, a lot of what I think people are concerned about is not so much trying to, a campaign trying to convince them to vote from one way or the other. It's more about, like, are we going to convince, Black people not to vote for Hillary Clinton? Like, that seems like a really, kind of very cynical kind of an approach to politics. So I think that's kind of the one thing that we don't want is vote, the targeting to be used for voter suppression.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think two moments in the Channel 4 segment really crystallized the importance of the right to see your own file as a way of dismantling the power of this data. So, for example, when the voter of color was shown her file and she was shown that she was marked for deterrence, she replied, "It makes her want to vote even more." And then when the Trump mom was shown her file, you could see that she was like viscerally uncomfortable with that kind of invasion of privacy, even though it was by her candidate. So I think we can reduce the mystery, the mystique, and the potential form of abuse of this data by showing it to voters. And interestingly, Senator Dianne Feinstein proposed the Voter Privacy Act, which would require campaigns and PACs to proactively disclose files to voters. So you would get your file in the mail, which I think would be a level of transparency which we get in the financial system. So why wouldn't we want it in the political system?
No, that makes a lot of sense. So we need to wrap up pretty quickly here. I think we'd like to try to end at 2:15. But if there's any final question that anybody has, feel free to dump it into the Q&A box. Otherwise, I think we'll, try to wrap up. I did want to let people know that we are going to be doing a program next week on the topic of truth decay with Jennifer Kavanaugh from the RAND Corporation and also Samantha North, who is a disinformation researcher who is interested in the topic of tribalism and how disinformation, tribalism are posing a unique threat to democracy at this time. I think it should be another really interesting conversation on the topic of defending our democracy. So again, the film that just came out featuring Brent's research and directed by Charles Creel is called People You May Know, and that's available on Amazon Prime streaming and Sundance Channel. The other film that David Carroll was featured in is called The Great Hack. That's available on Netflix. And both are really, really worth watching to get to understand this, problem a little bit more deeply. Looks like we have one last question. Is there any evidence of this type of data being used by the Democratic Party? David, you want to maybe take that?
I would say that the Democratic lists look very similar to what we've shown. Look, the combining of data brokers, probably the main difference is there's no evidence or no indication that they use ocean scores, psychographic data. But again, it's not the data, it's how it's used that matters. Is it used to scare people? Is it used to deter people from participation? It's the use that matters. That's where the abuse occurs.
And the fact that we basically have no laws on how this kind of data can be used. I mean, the one we do have is the HIPAA data, and even that's being abused at the moment. So
well, I think there is an issue around the sourcing of the data, not just the use of the data. And so if people are, if there's a breach of faith if people in churches are having their data collected and misused. And
so we kind of need to attack it on
a lot of those congregations
would
would have no idea that was occurring. And
Absolutely.
And it's a literal breach of faith. I'd also just correct you on it's Kat Gilling who's the director.
Yeah, I was it slipped my mind at this time, but yes, Kat Gillen and
throw that in there. You just got to get the right attributions.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I appreciate your time today, all of you, for coming together around this important topic. Again, please join us next Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern, a slightly different time than this event. And I'm sure we'll have a great conversation then.